My name is Bradley Watson, and I will be presenting the reliability of the Synoptic Gospels. And so, first, we're going to talk about what the Synoptic Gospels are. The Synoptic Gospels are the first three books of the New Testament. That would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Uh, and you may be asking why these are considered the Synoptic Gospels, and that's because they all have a similar flow, they all follow a similar chronology, and they all have a similar message in them, which would include the birth of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, the crucifixion, and the ascension. And so now that we know what the Synoptic Gospels are, we're going to be moving to the reliability of these Synoptic Gospels. And so we're going to be talking about ancient biographies, living memory, and oral tradition. So, first, ancient biographies. Ancient biographies are considered to be written in the first century, which the Gospels were written, the Synoptic Gospels were written uh, from 50 AD to 70 AD. And so we can look at other examples of biographies in that first century, and society agrees that those were historically based. And so, seeing that the Gospels were written during this time, we can assume that they are also historically based. That first century period is also considered to be the most historically based period. And so, because other biographies were written in the same time frame of these gospels, then we can believe, because of the culture, because of how things are written, that these gospels were similar in a fashion that they were all historically based, which leads to the gospels being reliable if they're historically based. The next is living memory. This is the period of time after an occurrence that witnesses are still alive. So for uh, Jesus, we have after Jesus died, the after Jesus was crucified and then ascended, um, we have the people that were there for his teaching. While those people were still alive after the ascension, those people had living memory. They were there during his teaching, and they were able to recall that. And so, because the Synoptic Gospels were written in between 50 and 70 AD, there is multiple people who were alive that saw Jesus' teaching. You can see that Luke clearly states this in his Bible, in his book, uh, in Luke 1, that he interviewed multiple witnesses and did his research. And so Luke would have had the opportunity to talk to the apostles and to talk to people who were there to hear Jesus' teaching. And so he had a living memory to help him write his gospel. Same thing with Mark. We learn uh, after the first century that Mark wrote his gospel off of Peter's witness. Um, and so his gospel also had that living memory of Peter's witness of Jesus' teaching in his book. And then, due to Markan priority, which is the most widely considered uh, choice for how the Gospels were written in order, uh, Mark being the first book that was written, Matthew and Luke then used Mark as sources for their books. And so, since Mark uh, was written first and through to Peter's witness, then Matthew and Luke, using Mark's book as a source, Matthew and Luke had living memory because Mark's book was written through living memory. So they're all connected and they all have living memory because they used Mark as a source, which in tandem was Peter. And then finally, we have oral tradition. Oral tradition was practiced throughout all of the Old Testament with the Torah and the laws, as well as the Proverbs and the Psalms. The entire Old Testament was taught and presented in a way for the Jews to remember in entirety uh, chapters that we consider chapters of the Bible. And so this was practiced even through Jesus's time of being alive. And so we can assume that Jesus' teaching would have been taught in a similar fashion. In Acts, when the apostles were presenting this to the world, we can assume, because of the way that they were taught the Old Testament, that they presented Jesus's teaching in a similar fashion through the testimonies of Jesus and his teaching, they presented it in a way that the audience could remember. And so, if the audience could remember and the apostles could remember, then when these books were written, the oral tradition, the teachings would have been remembered through this, and so the Gospels would have had this to back them. And so, finally, the synoptic Gospels are reliable because of the evidences of when this was written and the traditions around this time. So this leads to the synoptic Gospels being reliable, and because they're reliable, then we can believe that the events that happened in the Gospels were true. Thank you.